Welcome, everyone. I'm Jonathan Rosand. I'm the co-founder and co-director, along with my colleagues Rudy Tanzi and Greg Friccione, of the Henry and Allison McCance Center for Brain Health here at Mass General Hospital. And before we get started, just a few housekeeping details. For the first portion of today's meeting, as the panel presents, you will be in what's called listen-only mode. So no microphone or video capabilities are required to participate. At any point during the webinar, you can ask questions anonymously if you prefer through the Q&A function. Please keep the questions as brief as possible, and you may also utilize the chat function to share comments and feedback at any point. At the conclusion of the panel, we're going to invite you to join us with microphone and video capabilities for an open Q&A session. We'll manage this transition of capabilities at the back end. So if you prefer not to participate in this way, you may want to keep your microphone muted and your video turned off. The webinar will be recorded and a shareable link will be provided after the event concludes. So it's my great pleasure to open up the event, to welcome all of you. What you're going to learn about and hear about is the product of work that we started back in March as the pandemic swept through the United States and certainly through Boston. The McCance Center began regular weekly meetings to bring together all of our local experts in brain health to assess what was going on with the pandemic, how it was affecting people's mental health and brain health, and to really share what we were learning in real time because everything was evolving so quickly. There was a lot that we have since learned. We've been meeting continually. The group has grown. Now the group is 200 wide and includes experts from across Boston. And what you'll hear about today is from some of our experts drawn from the group. And we will address everything from how the virus itself has affected the brain to how pandemic conditions have affected our mental health. What we've learned is that this virus has had profound effects in lots of ways on all of us, not those of us who've been infected with the virus, but also those of us who've cared for loved ones who've been infected. So I'm now going to ask each speaker to introduce themselves and talk briefly about how their lives, how their work has been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'll start with Dr. Shamali.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for having me on this panel. Happy to be here and answer questions at the end. So it has been a very hard work since the pandemic started. I should probably start by telling you what I do. I am the medical director at the McCance Center and has been actually tasked from the start of the pandemic to launch and start and expand a post-COVID-19 clinic. And I also direct the neuropsychiatry clinics and the fellowship at MGH. We have had this clinic taking care of the people that have had post-COVID. Most of them in the beginnings were part of our healthcare providers, but then after that, it was open to everybody from the community. We take care in that clinic of patients that were not very severely sick with COVID and might have been hospitalized just minimally, and if not, just from the community. We have worked also to bridge with communities that have low access to healthcare as well, and trying to get that bridge with us at the clinic. Our clinic very much focused on the effect of COVID or neuro-COVID on brain health, as well as all of the neuropsychiatric symptoms as well. And I will hand it over to Dr. Brian Edlow, who will give the other aspect of care.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. It's an honor to be here. My name is Brian Edlow. I'm a member of the neurocritical care faculty at Mass General Hospital, and I direct the lab for neuroimaging of coma and consciousness. I'd like to share with you briefly some observations from the early stages of the pandemic, caring for patients in the intensive care unit, and how those observations have informed our current understanding of how this virus affects the brain and how we can provide the best possible care for these patients moving forward. Early on in the pandemic, in March and early April, like other hospitals on the East Coast and around the world, there was a large number of patients admitted to our ICUs. And the focus early on was supporting patients with respiratory failure using mechanical ventilation and saving their lives so that they could make it through this multi-system illness that often caused kidney failure and other dysfunction of organ systems. For those who survived, there was an unexpected observation after about 2 to 4 weeks when the first round of survivors started to come off of the ventilators, the breathing tubes were coming out, and the intravenous sedation that was needed to keep them comfortable and safe on the ventilator was stopped. What we saw was that many of these patients did not wake up and did not recover consciousness as soon as we expected. This was a common problem at our hospital and at other hospitals around the world. We were talking to all of our colleagues and collaborators globally who are experiencing the same thing and observing the same thing. And what this has led to is extensive research, the fruits of which are just coming into focus as far as what is going on within the brain, whether it's the sedation itself or the low oxygen levels from the lung infection or a whole host of other factors. Those are some of the potential contributing causes to this phenomenon of delayed recovery of consciousness after surviving severe COVID-19. And from a clinical standpoint, the problem that I'd like to highlight briefly now, and I'm happy to discuss later in the question and answer session, is that often family members need to make decisions about whether to continue with life-sustaining care during a period where it's still uncertain whether their loved one is going to ultimately recover consciousness. And so one of our many goals for treating these patients is to help inform that decision as best we can and guide families about what to expect. But I want to acknowledge that there is still substantial uncertainty about how to best treat this particular patient population and how to most appropriately guide families through that decision-making process. And I'll stop there and pass the torch to Dr. Karath.
Hi, thank you. And thank you again for having me in the panel. So I'm Dr. Yaquel Quiroz. I'm a clinical neuropsychologist, and as part of my clinical role, I'm the director of the Multicultural Assessment Center. And in that role, I see patients with memory and other thinking difficulties. And I'm very interested in the context of COVID to understand more the complications of COVID in terms of like memory difficulties, attention difficulties, and all the changes that has been seen now in the COVID survivors. Very interested in particular in the changes that are seen in older individuals and how that may impact the risk of individuals to develop cognitive decline and even the risk to develop dementia or even Alzheimer's disease. In my research role, I'm the director of the Multicultural Alzheimer's Prevention Program. And in the past year, I have been leading some of the research characterizing the impact of COVID-19 on the risk, as I was saying before, and also the well-being and memory of older individuals that survive COVID-19, but also the impact on just by living the pandemic in older individuals that were actually seen in any of the research projects that we have. So combining all of this like a clinical care that Dr. Shamari mentioned, but also like research participants that were involved in our projects, the goal is to better characterize how COVID-19, both the ones that actually have the disease, but also the ones that were exposed to living in the pandemic are increased risk to develop any kind of cognitive decline. So we'll be more than happy to answer any questions in the QA as they relate to changes in memory and cognition or thinking skills. And now I'm gonna pass it to Dr. Rudy Tanzi.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Some of you may know I'm a geneticist who's worked on Alzheimer's disease for decades. With the advent of the pandemic, I've been doing a bunch of work with colleagues on assessing the genetics of the COVID virus and what makes the COVID virus more contagious or more severe in effect. And on the other side of the coin, the host. We've been looking at what makes a human with their own gene variants more susceptible to infection or severity. So I can talk later on a little bit about the difference between the three major variants. There are actually 5 variants now, and more coming. And I can tell you a little bit about what we've learned about the genes and which genes predispose one to perhaps a more severe reaction to COVID. But I'll wait for Jonathan to prompt me on that later. But thanks again for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Rudy. I think I'd like to lead off with Dr. Shmali. If you could comment a little bit on your experience and your colleagues' experience with how COVID has affected populations in various disadvantaged settings, and how you've seen that play out in terms of its impact on brain health.
Yeah, thank you. So COVID has impacted a lot the population that came from settings with a lot of vulnerabilities to start with. Those are settings where patients might have had a lot of traumatic event happen to them early on, and then they were hit very badly with COVID. They were at most risk to be exposed with COVID because of where they were living, their living situation, their employment. They could not stop working like other people were able to quarantine at home. And so they became very sick sometimes. And at the same time, their family support might not have been the same, which also impacted very much their neuropsychiatric health. But what we also have found is that those patients, once they started to get better, and even if they were with us in the clinic, very quickly, they were also very much anxious to go back to work. Many of them has held like multiple jobs really to make ends meet at the end of this pandemic. And they wanted to go back despite everything else going on with their life, because what was happening to them is they needed to put bread on the table. So we continue to care for this population and trying to address their needs, but also allowing them to have the safe space to really be treated and cared for as well.
Thank you. One question that comes up often, Dr. Quiros, is what is brain fog? I know it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but maybe as a neuropsychologist, you can sort of break it apart for us, what you're seeing patients managing.
Oh, that's a really good question. As you were saying, it can mean different things to different people, but one of the main complaints that we are seeing is that people are reporting changes in their way of thinking. They are not thinking as clear as they were thinking before. They are not as sharp as they were before. And what we are seeing in the testing is like more difficulties, problems with concentration, difficulties focusing, or even like multitasking or organizing information. Especially if they were very good at doing something like that before. Some people may also have difficulties with short-term memory, for instance, even if they didn't have that before. But in general, you can see some variability depending on the individuals. Some other people may also reporting difficulties finding the words, or even like losing the train of thought, like they may be saying something and all of a sudden forgetting some words of what they want to say. So it changes, it varies between individuals, but definitely it's not like, so it's a change in the way that they used to be functioning before, and they are not as sharp as they were before.
And Dr. Edlow, you have done quite a few imaging studies of individuals who've had severe COVID, and you obviously know about the literature, the studies of less severe affected individuals. What has the neuroimaging taught us about what might be the cause of this brain fog?
Thank you for this important question, Jonathan. I'll mention that in the beginning, we really had no idea what to expect. The first imaging case report was not published until March 31st, a couple of weeks into this. That paper has since been cited over 1,000 times over the last year, and there has been a rapid acceleration in the number of imaging studies by our group and others. They have collectively shown a wide variety of different types of brain injury that include injury to the microvasculature, the small blood vessels that deliver blood and oxygen to the brain, clots within those vessels, inflammation within those blood vessels, leakage of blood out of those small vessels. These are all things that have been seen in the imaging studies. And in the most severely injured patients, those types of injuries can be seen by MRI in anywhere up to 50 to 75%, depending on which study that you look at. We've also seen injury to the white matter, the part of the brain that sends the signals from one part to another. The exact underlying mechanism or cause of that white matter injury remains uncertain, but might be due to inflammation or this cytokine storm that has been described. And I think we're beginning to appreciate the association between those imaging findings and the prolonged disorders of consciousness that I referred to earlier, to what degree those findings are also contributing to the long-term brain fog and other neuropsychiatric symptoms that have been mentioned earlier. I think that's still an active question. I'd be curious to hear the thoughts of other panelists on that.
Well, one thing we are learning is that many of these symptoms are getting better, thankfully. Smell tends to get better in the vast majority of people, and the brain fog does seem to get better as well, although it can take quite a few months. I think in the context of the imaging that you're describing, most of the work has been done in very severely affected people. And so it's important to keep in mind that we really still don't have the technology really to understand what's going on at the smallest level often in patients who are, those of us who are able to sort of keep going to work and didn't get hospitalized for our COVID, maybe just had a positive test, but still have some kind of foggy feeling or dizziness that's bothering us. So obviously lots more to understand. Dr. Tanzi, I think everybody wants to know about these variants. We read about these variants. We're frightened of these variants. Can you give us a little bit of a primer on how to understand what we're reading in the papers?
Yeah, I mean, the original COVID-19, as you know, began in the Wuhan seafood market in China, where they sell livestock and also exotic species. And on the western part of the market, where the animal facilities are, that's where this really broke out. We don't know if it's from a infected animal or infected person who encountered the virus. But since that time, as viruses do, they begin to mutate. And the COVID virus uses a spike protein to basically hijack a protein on our cells called the ACE2 receptor. So the spike protein binds to our ACE2 receptor, and that's how it gets in. And what we're seeing is the emergence of new variants that have mutations mainly in that spike protein. These variants can have anywhere from 7 to as many as 20 different mutations where in the actual spike protein. And the result is it can make the virus more contagious. So the first one we heard about was the UK variant, also originally called the Kent strain. And what we know about that is it definitely increases contagion, but so far vaccines work pretty well against it, maybe a little less efficacious, but pretty well against it. And another variant came out of South Africa, also related to the spike protein. And this one ends up being a little more worrying because if you look at how the vaccines like from Moderna and Pfizer, which are the main ones we use here, how they work against the South African variant, it looks like anywhere from a 6.5-fold to about an 8.5-fold decreased efficacy. So they still offer protection, but with that decreased efficacy, it means that you could get sick, but hopefully the vaccine will keep you from getting severely sick or needing to be hospitalized. So that's the problem with the South African. And the third variant is the most troublesome. That's the Brazilian variant, which actually was first found in Tokyo in January of this year in 4 travelers who came from Amazonas, Brazil. And now it's the dominating circulating virus in Brazil. It's also reached here. And what's worrying there is that a lot of folks in different cities in Brazil already had exposure to the original virus in the first wave in the summer. But just in December, we saw a 6-fold higher number of cases in Brazil, and they're mainly of this new variant. And what the South African and Brazilian variants have in common that makes them less, where the vaccines are less effective, is this mutation called E484K, or we sometimes call it EEK, because it causes problems for the vaccines. And last week, the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said that, UK is definitely the most dominant strain now, 20,000 cases in 50 states, dominated by the UK. But for the first time, the Brazilian hit the number 2 spot, 434 people in the US, and the largest number of cases right here in Massachusetts, followed by Illinois and Florida. So what we've been doing is looking at the database of all the COVID variants, genetics and sequences, and we map, for each mutation, we look at what are the odds of getting more severely sick, what are the odds of dying, and we're mapping it out for each mutation so that as these variants arise, we can look at which mutations are there and then get a better idea of what to expect and how much to prepare for them. And we hope there'll be boosters against some of these variants where the vaccines don't work as well, especially like the South African and the Brazilian. So that's just an overview.
So we have one question that's just come in that I'm sure everybody wants to hear the answer to, which is, what are some of the most common neurologic, neuropsychiatric brain complaints that we're seeing in our COVID-19 brain health individuals? So maybe Dr. Shamali, you could start off and give us a sense of what the range of challenges these patients faces.
Yeah, so those patients present often with this like bigger complaint about brain fog that you, Dr. Quiroz, actually attended to. With that actually comes a lot of, at times, confusion, their inability to multitask the way that they used to. So there will be this brain fog, some memory issues, but they also come with a lot of anxiety. Anxiety is very prevalent in that cohort. Some also have exacerbated mood disorders, like if they were depressed before, they can get depressed even more. Patients that have had a history of headaches or migraine get more of that also when we see them. And there is a lot of sleep difficulties. And the sleep difficulties is also like spans from insomnia to for people that have had some perturbing dreams, they could also have nightmares, but that also impacts on their functioning, on their day-to-day functioning, on the way that they can actually do whatever they need to be doing. Fatigue is also a big symptom. Some patients, actually the majority of them, just say kind of, I do a few things and then I'm out. And without the warning also, which also reminds us a lot about all of those post-infectious neuropsychiatric syndrome where you have mental fatigue without a warning that you're going to really just go out and unable to input anymore. So those are the main, I would say, complaints that we get to see patients for.
One other that I will add that is slightly less common, but we see a lot of is dizziness. And this dizziness is remarkable because it does seem to be accompanied often by some difficulty in regulating the blood pressure. So normally our bodies will match the blood pressure to make sure that we get enough blood, whether we're standing up straight and fighting gravity to that degree or lying flat. But something about this virus in a small percentage of people, but because the virus infects many people, it's a lot of people, seems to interfere with the body's ability to get that blood pressure just right every time you're shifting position. So we're learning about this, and there's a big group across Mass General and Brigham that's now studying this and trying to isolate exactly why it is that the blood pressure is dysregulated and what can be done about it. So maybe you can, Dr. Quiroz, you can talk a little bit about some of the treatments or some of the interventions that centers like ours are starting to try to help people, and maybe what the future might hold.
Yeah, I think that for the, I'm not very familiar with the trial that like Dr. Guzman is doing, so maybe you can speak.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe you can.
Yeah, sure. So, well, one of the things that we've learned is that there are, it's important to figure out what's wrong. So, you know, brain fog is a big term. And so as Dr. Quiroz was discussing, there are many aspects of the way the brain works that we can kind of break down. Is it concentration? Is it memory? Is it your ability to attend to, lots of things in your environment and multitask? And so we found that the usual treatments, let's say for ADD, attention deficit disorder, can sometimes be very helpful for patients with brain fog, as an example. There are clinical trials that we are just starting. There are a couple of supplements that we think might be of benefit. And then Dr. Quiros, you and your colleagues have a very helpful cognitive behavioral therapy program for individuals who have difficulty with attentional regulation, things like that. But there is a lot that can be done. That's why it's important to get help and for people who are having complaints to seek help. Dr. Edlow, if I could ask you another question that's come up is there a connection between the severity of the COVID, so in the patients in the ICU, how severely they are affected, and their subsequent complications? You and your colleagues have a well-established neuro recovery for COVID program for COVID survivors who've been quite ill.
So it's a really important question. My understanding, the short answer is yes. I'll acknowledge that I don't personally see those patients in our neuro recovery clinic. I take care of many of them while they're in the ICU, as mentioned earlier. But my understanding is that there is likely a relationship. What the exact underlying mechanism is, again, is unclear. But there was recently a study published suggesting that upwards of 33%, a third of all patients with COVID, have some degree of neuropsychiatric symptoms. So, I think the exact risk factors for those long COVID symptoms are still being worked out. I'd be curious to hear from those who see the patients in clinic if you've observed an association, but my understanding is that the literature would support that.
Yeah, we are seeing that individuals who've been in the ICU longer, for example, had a breathing machine connected to support their breathing for a longer period of time, do have more severe brain symptoms. It's important to keep in mind that these are challenges that people who recover from a long ICU stay have regardless of COVID. And I think that the jury's out as to how much of this is COVID and how much of this is what we call the critical illness that is the result of the lung challenges that severe COVID can.
If I may add one more comment, Jonathan. So you make it a very important point that the critical care community has been taking care of people with respiratory failure requiring mechanical ventilation for many years. So that part of the story is not new, but in our experience and what's been reported around the world, it is the duration of being on a ventilator and the amount of sedation that's being needed for these patients that in some cases is unprecedented. And the analogy that I think is pretty appropriate here, you imagine pressing the reset button on your computer and you expect it to come back online. If you held that reset button down for a month, what would you expect? Is your computer going to turn back on? For many of these patients, they required sedation for weeks, if not longer than a month. And that's a long time for a human brain to undergo those types of exposure to those types of medications.
Dr. Tanzi, one question that often comes up because so many of the individuals who've been stricken with COVID, particularly severe COVID, have been elderly, is what's the relationship between our risk of Alzheimer's and the severity of COVID or the susceptibility to COVID? And in particular, there are some well-known genes that influence risk of Alzheimer's. Might there be a role for those genes like ApoE in COVID susceptibility?
Well, yeah, beginning with ApoE, it turns out that the ApoE epsilon 4 variant, that mutation that increases risk for Alzheimer's, one copy of E4 increases risk about 4-fold, 2 copies 14-fold. It's kind of a similar thing going on with risk for severe disease after COVID infection. One copy of E4 increases risk of severity by about 2-fold. But if you have 2 copies of E4, you have a much higher risk of severity and even increased risk of death. So I don't want to scare anybody who's an E4 homozygous carrier. That's about 2% of the population, and among Alzheimer's patients, that 2% doubles or triples to about 5%. But ApoE4 looks like a risk factor. And it's interesting to think about Alzheimer's disease because we always think about ApoE4 as a risk factor for Alzheimer's because of its effect on amyloid deposition. But ApoE4 is part of our immune system as well. And you have to wonder whether E4 is predisposing to Alzheimer's because of increased risk to infections that come with age. So there's that thought that comes. The other genes that have come up for susceptibility to severe disease because of your human DNA variants in your genome include things like the ABO blood group, although that's still controversial. Whether risk of infection was lower in O group blood carriers versus A. A seems to be a higher risk of infection, but that's still controversial. But if you look at the cytokines, you hear about cytokine storm with COVID, this massive inflammatory response to the virus that puts you at higher risk for severity. There are actually about a dozen different genes for cytokines now, including TNF alpha and interferon alpha, the receptors for those, a whole slew of them that are showing mutations and variants that predispose you to higher risk for severity and even death. So that makes sense because that's what COVID does. It triggers a cytokine storm, and if it triggers too much of a inflammation, then you're at higher risk for a severe disease or death. So that's basically the summary of that.
Thank you. A couple more questions, and then we're going to be inviting the audience to join on screen with the microphone. We have one question about does brain fog ever go away completely? I think maybe for Dr. Shamali. Related to that, what might be the relationship between having a vaccine and its impact on brain fog? There's been something written in the popular press about that.
All right. So let me take the first question. So at least from what we are seeing in the clinic, brain fog gets better. People do improve. As everything in neuropsychiatric clinic and issues with also cognition after, let's say, a neurological illness or any other kind of medical illness that has given a lot of impact on people, I always tell my patients that you have to be patient and wait for a year and a season for things to go back to normal. And I don't know why this a bit around the 15 months that people clear, but we have been seeing patients now that we started seeing, I would say, around April with the COVID, and we have discharged people from our clinic. So there are people that get better. Of course, it's a multidisciplinary clinic, so we ask our colleagues from occupational therapy to help us out, for people to do a lot of cognitive rehab. Sometimes patients will need to be on medication, but the bottom line is that people do get better. Regarding the vaccine, I think the reactions are really over a spectrum. There are people that there have been reports that actually some people have done much better, and getting them actually to be part of multiple articles in the news that you get the vaccine to get better. We have had patients in our clinic that they got the vaccine and they felt really worse, both with the symptoms recurring and or mostly the headaches becoming more severe and then not clearing for many, many weeks after that. So I think the jury is still out on that. And I think people kind of, depending on that spectrum, are also kind of landing on that spectrum.
No, a couple of other questions. They're so good. I want to make sure we give them time before we go to live. So here's an impact on the healthcare providers who've been caring for these patients. Maybe Dr. Quiros, you could just comment on what you and your colleagues in psychology and psychiatry have been seeing and been doing. You've been doing a lot to help care for these frontline workers. Yeah.
But it's part of the impact, and even beyond like the healthcare workers and everybody working with COVID has to be with the well-being of everybody. I think that it's very important that everybody checks and get the support that we need, because as Dr. Shimali mentioned before, like anxiety and depression, I will add that PTSD, that is a post-traumatic stress disorder, is also very common and has been linked particular to the ones that have been providing care to the COVID-19 patients. is a reality, and it's something that has been very important, has been impacting a lot to the ones caring for these patients. So the psychiatry department in particular has developed some programs to support the healthcare providers. And I think that beyond MGH, it's important that we provide that care and support to everybody that is caring for those that actually have been suffering from COVID. And beyond the patients, also the families of these patients and the community at large, because it's going, they say like COVID is a pandemic, so the community at large has been impacted as well. So we run a study, as I mentioned before, to measure some of the impact of the well-being in older individuals, for instance, and we noticed that everybody reported higher levels or impact on the well-being. So it's something that is, in fact, is impacting everybody beyond being the healthcare providers. Of course, they are more impacted because they are directly involved in the care of the patients. But the pandemic is something that I think that has impacted the well-being of everybody. So definitely providing some support at all the different levels is key for us to actually, make it through.
So we're going to now open up the audience, open up the screen, as you'll see, to anybody who would like to join for a live question and answer. If you don't want to join, just make sure you turn off your microphone and your video capability so you're not inadvertently caught on camera. And this is a time when folks can start asking questions, and I'll turn over first to Rudy Tanzi.
Hey, Jonathan, so one of the questions in the question box was, are there things we can do to help protect brain health amid other aspects of the pandemic, stress, isolation, anxiety? And my good friend and co-author, Deepak Chopra, is here. And I'm wondering, that's something that Deepak and I have written about. And I'm just wondering if Deepak might want to comment a bit on what we can do to help protect ourselves during this pandemic. I know that Deepak's thought a lot about it.
Well, thanks, Rudy. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, everyone, for having me on this. Rudy, you and I have talked about this, but one of the common denominators in both those who are getting acutely sick and chronically sick is, as has been so beautifully articulated, is inflammation. It goes along with stress, goes along with anxiety and depression. So anything you can do to override sympathetic overdrive and increase vagal tone will help mitigate at least the morbidity, if not sometimes even the morbidity from COVID storms, from these cytokine storms. Sleep, stress management, exercise, mind-body coordination, deep breathing, emotional resiliency, nutrition, a plant-based diet with maximum diversity of plant-based foods, which is not manufactured, refined, processed, has too much sugar, antibiotics, steroids, and chemicals, will revitalize the microbiome to some extent, hopefully, decrease the inflammation. So all these things are very important and as adjunctive treatments, but nothing more to say from my side.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Maurizio, Dr. Fava, welcome.
That was terrific. I have a question. As a basketball fan, I've seen some of the athletes that have had COVID-19 come back, and some of them have been criticized for kind of lack of motivation, not being into the game, even though they've recovered physically. And I know we can't speculate because, but do you think that, in some ways, because we certainly see sometimes apathy or lack of motivation as a kind of residual symptom, do you think that it's possible that, we may see in professional sports, all these athletes that are being exposed, some of them struggling to regain kind of the extra drive to succeed?
I'll take that, and then Dr. Shamali may have made other observations in her patients, but I have seen just that in different contexts, and it's often because it's so hard to concentrate. That's what patients describe. So it's sort of like you're working harder, and so things are slower. what we're seeing is that fatigue as a complaint, which is a very difficult, you know what to call it, but you don't know exactly what it is, but anyone who has it can tell you they've got it, is really disabling. And so you can imagine that this is probably another challenge that athletes are facing, where even though they've recovered, they still can't quite overcome the fatigue that even a fully fit individual can overcome. Yes.
Yeah, I would just add that, and we go over this with the neuropsychiatry fellows, is that the brain is not inviolate to the periphery. And so there are areas of capillary endothelium that provide a window into the brain. So when we talk about cytokine storm, one area that I think is very vulnerable and may turn out to be of importance is the organum vasculosum, which abuts the anterior cingulate, the subgenual anterior cingulate. And of course, we know that when that area is rendered dysfunctional by some lesion or inflammatory process, that we wind up with a Bulick syndrome, loss of motivation and apathy. And this was driven home by our very own Marco Loggia at the Martinos Center when I had a conversation with him about fibromyalgia. And, you know, many of us were perplexed by the chronicity of fibromyalgia and its symptoms. And of course, fatigue is part of that as well. Chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia are frequently comorbid. That patients may wind up having neuroinflammation in that area, and it may be leading to these chronic fatigue symptoms that we're seeing.
So you raise a good point. There was a lot of fancy, medical stuff that you just referred to. I don't want anyone to feel overwhelmed who doesn't have the background, but I think I want to focus in on one point you made, which maybe Dr. Tanzi could elaborate. You mentioned neuroinflammation. And neuroinflammation we hear a lot about, and we talk a lot about it as maybe the agent that acts to do a lot of damage to the brain. Could you talk about that, Dr. Tanzi? Help us understand sort of the role of neuroinflammation in COVID, and then maybe a little bit more generally.
Yeah, I think in COVID we're still trying to get a feel for how much neuroinflammation is happening in the brain versus around the brain, around the blood-brain barrier and vessels around the brain. And in Alzheimer's disease, certainly, we know the bulk of synapse loss and neuronal damage, loss of nerve cells, comes from neuroinflammation that was driven originally by what we call initiating pathology, plaques, tangles, and that spreading pathology of cell death that triggers in the brain, the glial cells that are normally housekeeping and nurturing to turn into killers and say, wow, neurons are dying, we must be infected, wipe it out. So luckily in the brain, there's not a lot of ACE2 receptor, which is what the COVID spike protein uses to replicate. And so it's a little different than, for example, what would happen with cytomegalovirus or herpes virus. So I think time will tell how much COVID is causing neuroinflammation within the brain, analogous to what happens in Alzheimer's, or whether COVID as a virus is triggering amyloid deposition, which other viruses can do, where the amyloid acts as an antimicrobial peptide response. And so I think the jury's still out, but certainly there's inflammation around vessels, there's blood vessel issues, there's blood-brain barrier inflammation, and that's enough to cause this delirium, this brain fog that we're talking about. But hopefully it will be more resolvable than in a progressive neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's disease.
And I think you and Deepak in your books really talk about some of the lifestyle habits that we can initiate to promote our brain health seem to act through reducing neuroinflammation.
Yeah, we use the term SHIELD, and which is based on the 6 pillars that Deepak talked about. Deepak, do you want to mention the 6 pillars? Because I think we hear about SHIELD all the time. Yeah, you're muted. You're muted, Deepak. Muted, yeah.
I did mention them. So deep rest through deep sleep and also through meditation, mindfulness, exercise, mind-body coordination, deep breathing, emotional resiliency, nutrition, and healthy relationships. All these have an effect on our cytokines, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But you know that better than I do.
And then in the McCance Center, we used SHIELD, which is born out of our last book, sleep, handling stress, H is handling stress, I, interaction with others, staying social, especially during the pandemic. Call your older loved ones who are stuck at home because of maybe, loneliness is a risk factor for Alzheimer's, and exercise, learning new things. So hopefully this panel is helping protect the learning new things. Well, if we're putting you to sleep, it's still protecting you. That's great. And diet. Yeah. So it's kind of, these are common themes for, and of course with diet, sugar, fat, salt, lowering those, more plant-based diet, like you said, much better.
So there's one thing that I want to make sure we answer that was in the chat, the question about what can we do for loved ones to support them through their recovery. And I'll just give you some of the sort of observations that have been shared with me from the families we've cared for. And I think the most important answer to that question is help your loved ones describe what they're experiencing. Help them to understand it, help them to explain it to you, and listen to them carefully, because it's really hard to, if you're going through this, if you're going through brain fog, it's like walking through fog, and it's a different experience for each individual who's affected, and it's very hard to describe. And so it's probably going to take time. And the other experience that's been relayed to me very often is that the experience of time itself can be changed, often slowed down. And it's very frustrating because you get the people will say, well, you look great, but on the inside, our patients don't feel great, but they can't exactly say why often. So I think patience and listening to your loved ones and helping them to find the words to explain what they're experiencing.
Hey, Jonathan, I would like to ask the clinicians here, there's a question there about vitamins and supplements. And first, we always like to say regarding supplements that in the absence of clinical trials and definitive data, anything we say is based on a leap of faith, coming from lab models or from limited epidemiological data, or maybe a pilot clinical trial. So with that said, one of the things that happens with COVID infection is that your NAD plus levels plummet. NAD plus is needed to make ATP, the fuel for the cell. And so that's why we're doing this true Niagen or nicotinamide riboside trial, because nicotinamide riboside is the precursor of NAD plus. And NAD plus, if it's increased, will increase ATP. And Charlie Brenner, who discovered nicotinamide riboside and is the father of True Niagen, the product we're trying, he claims the NAD really plummets. And so I'm wondering whether that's one question for our clinical crew. And then also vitamin D3 has been said to help quell the cytokine storm. And so I've upped my own vitamin D3 take. I'm just wondering if what folks think about vitamin D3 and also about the NAD plus issue and nicotinamide riboside. Well, maybe no one has an opinion.
I can. I want to see if I'm going to call on somebody. I think let's start with, since we have Dr. Fava, the Chief of Psychiatry, on the line, maybe you can comment a little bit to the extent that you want to.
Well, Rudy, I happen to share your views about NAD+. So I have been using it in some of my patients with the rationale that you've outlined. I think that, kind of the jury is still out in terms of, what is that? There's clearly a lot of interest scientifically on the potential of NAD+ and its role, both in cognitive impairment and aging and so forth. But I think that we need more studies. At least that's my personal view. Jonathan, what do you think?
Yeah, so I agree. And in fact, it's a we are indeed studying this as Rudy, as Dr. Tanzi just mentioned. And one of the challenges, but great opportunities, has been COVID has moved so fast that government funding hasn't been able to keep up with funding the research. So we've been very fortunate to have philanthropists support some of the most important studies and get them going quickly. So one of them is this clinical trial of NAD plus that is about to be launched.
Well, it's of nicotinamide.
I'm sorry, of nicotinamide.
Yeah, because the NAD plus won't survive the gut.
Right. Another, just one other example is Dr. Edlow has been fortunate to receive foundation money very quickly to support studying patients in the spring with severe COVID. So it's really important to fund these research studies in order to answer these questions. Without research, without carefully performed studies, we're not able to answer the questions. The last thing I'll say, and then I'm going to turn to Dr. Shamali to allow her to talk a little bit about how she approaches the treatment using supplements and vitamin D, is you may have seen that I think in the last 3 or 4 days, there was a high-profile publication that received a lot of news coverage about vitamin D. And there was a relationship between relatively low but not unhealthy vitamin D levels and risk of being diagnosed with COVID or having a positive test. So that's a question that's going to be answered with a clinical trial. The good news is that it's relatively safe to take these vitamin D supplements, and so it sounds like some of the folks on this panel are already doing that. But we don't know whether that will truly have an impact on your susceptibility to SARS-CoV-2. So Dr. Shamali, do you want to comment a little bit on some of these questions and how you might recommend using supplements for individuals who are suffering from brain fog or some of these other brain-related complaints?
Yeah, sure, thank you. So the supplements, we do use them in other instances of brain fog and neurological diseases. I mean, vitamin D has been very well established in MS and cognitive dysfunction, and for multiple sclerosis and cognitive dysfunction. And for people with low vitamin D, for the same multiple sclerosis plaques, they actually do worse than people with normal to higher vitamin D. And after that, I mean, there has been a lot of studies linking vitamin D with cognition, but also with mood. So with people having better mood, they could also have better cognition. So we do recommend for people, first of all, we test their vitamin D, and if they are very low, then definitely we move forward to treat them, even at times with mega doses weekly. But other than that, we ask them to grab like over the counter to be on vitamin D. The other supplements that has for many, many years also gained a lot of scientific traction as a neuroprotector is fish oil or the omega-3. So those are also something else that we do recommend. For COVID, there was a lot of talk over zinc, whether that can help, and then mega dosages of vitamin C just to actually not very much help with the post-COVID, but just your resiliency against the virus. I'm not sure if the studies have talked about that. I think what is very helpful for patients is one, to validate their symptoms and try to say that we are here to help them. And then it comes within that multidisciplinary notion that we are addressing their fatigue. Let's say with rehab, we are addressing their brain fog by understanding where this brain fog is coming from. So if it is due to anxiety, if it is due to depression, if it is due that because they're not sleeping, or if it is due to mental fatigue, then addressing those symptoms as we know how to do them best. I mean, from other clinics and other disorders, we have seen those symptoms in. And then being there for them, being there for the caregivers, helping them through it all is the way I think that the patients appreciate that and move forward with it. So that would be my take.
Thank you.
Hey, Jonathan. I see Marielle Hemingway, who many of you know, I'm sure you all know, is here. And she's done a lot of work and authored books on lifestyle and self-help. And Marielle, I'm just wondering if you want to comment on how you've been dealing with the pandemic and COVID. Maybe.
I'm so sorry. I didn't realize you were going to call on me.
I know. I called you out. I sent it in the chat. I said I might call on you, but I'm sorry if you didn't. If I took you by surprise.
Oh my God. Okay. Sorry, everyone. Hi. Oh wow, that's awesome. How have I been dealing with it? Well, as you know, I'm a big believer in your protocol of SHIELD and how we live our lifestyle and how I mean, we're big believers that, getting out in the sun, getting vitamin D, connecting in nature, meditation, all of these things, we're not doctors, but, vitamin D is a big part of our lives. NAD, I think, has been kind of beneficial to us. We did have the virus ourselves. It was mild for us. And we, did protocols that you've been speaking about and other things that you've been speaking about that we didn't understand. We weren't doing probably, but yeah, I think that lifestyle is a big, important thing. And one of the things that we feel because of COVID and because of what it's done to us as a nation, as in the world, is that lifestyle has to be one of the main things that everybody focuses on. I really believe that how we take care, self-care is healthcare. That's kind of how Bobby and I think of our lives. We just believe that now is, because of the unknowns, because people don't know what to do, sleep is so important. So it's just like, drink less, eat better food, cut sugar out, do all those things. I did notice, it was interesting that you were mentioning dizziness, because having had I realized I had dizziness quite a lot lately. And I realized that, sorry, cat invasion. So, we do, all of us get affected, even if we're healthy, but I think lifestyle will play a big part in creating a healthier, body that's going to have a better immune system. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think we're at the end of the hour. I'm going to conclude. There was one question I want to make sure I just briefly answer it before closing. And many of you, certainly in the Boston area, will have seen that front page article this past week on the neurologic or brain complications of COVID. And I just want to remind this group and for you to share with your friends that there's a lot being done to figure out what's going on and to help people at the same time. So we in the McCance Center have brought together our colleagues led by Dr. Shamali. So we have psychiatrists, neurologists, therapists working on what can we do for patients today. And then we have initiated a whole series of studies with our colleagues, not just at Mass General and at Mass General Brigham, but across Boston, to try and figure out what exactly is going on with the blood vessels in the brain, what exactly is going on, let's say, with the regulation of blood pressure, the autonomic system, for example. So we welcome you to come see us, but certainly you should keep posted on the emerging research opportunities that will be available to patients who are affected, because we really don't know yet what's going on sufficiently. So thank you, everybody, for joining. I want to particularly thank our panelists who've joined both initially here locally and from faraway places as well. And we look forward to keeping you informed, and thank you for your questions. We'll make sure to get more answers out over time through our various public communications.
Great.
Bye.
Thanks, John. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.